Welcome, everyone, to the first ever ILA webinar. My name is Gamma Perucci, and I'm the Dean of the McDonough Center for Leadership and Business at Marietta College and a board member of the International Leadership Association. The webinar will be available for repeat viewing online. The link will be emailed to everyone next week when it's up. During the presentation, please type in your questions for our presenter, Jay Conger. We will pass them on to him during the Q&A at the end. We would like to thank our sponsors, Oracle and the ILA's Applied Leadership and Business Leadership member interest groups for their generous support. At this time, I will call on my colleague, Arthur Chu, Director of Global Organization and Talent Development for Oracle and the Chair-elect of the ILA's Business Leadership MIG, to introduce our presenter. Arthur?
Thank you, Gamma. It's a pleasure to participate in our inaugural webinar today and to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jay Conger. Before I do so, I wanted to give a special thanks to a few of my partners in co-organizing this event. First, Dr. Diane Dixon, Principal of Dixon & Associates and faculty at Johns Hopkins University. Diane is chair of our ILA Applied Member Interest Group. And Dr. Scott Allen, Principal of the Center for Leadership Development, who's a faculty member at John Cale University, and Scott is our chair-elect of Applied Member Interest Group. And my colleague, Dr. Rick Bridges, Principal of our Leadership Group and faculty at the University of Phoenix, and chair of our Global Business Leadership Member Interest Group. And finally, Deborah Deruver, ILA Membership Director and our Logistics Coordinator for the event today. Those of you who are members of the ILA will know that we have 5 member interest groups, or MIGs as we call them, that focus on different aspects of leadership such as applied, business, education, public service, and scholarship. One of the goals of our MIGs this year has been to extend our communities of scholarship and practice through interaction beyond our annual conferences, so we hope that this webinar will be one of many to come to help us achieve this objective. And we're pleased today to have such a global audience of over 100 attendees registered from Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America. In addition, our membership interest groups are creating new standing committees to help with our programs, communications, and conferences. So we would encourage all members to volunteer for a committee by contacting the ILA office or your respective MIG chair. This will be a great way to network with like-minded colleagues and also thought leaders in the field. And, of course, for those of you who are not members, as well as those of you who are members of the ILA, we invite you to join us in our ambitious quest to transform leadership thought and practice by joining us at our conference in beautiful Vancouver, Canada on October 31st through November 3rd. Now, without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today, Dr. Jay Conger. Dr. Conger really needs no introduction, as he's widely recognized throughout the world as a preeminent thought leader in talent leadership and leadership development. He publishes widely in top-tier journals and consults Fortune 100 companies, and he's been recognized by Business Week as one of the world's 5 top management gurus. He is currently the Henry Kravis Leadership Chair of Leadership Studies at Claremont Methodist College. He is also a senior research scientist at the Center for Effective Organizations, and he's visiting professor of organizational behavior at the London Business School. So today we're fortunate to have him share some of his cutting-edge thoughts on leadership using as a springboard a recent article that was published in Harvard Business Review entitled Making Your Organization a Talent Factory. Let's join Jay's discussion in progress as he explains how he transitioned from studying leaders individually to how organizations can support leadership and talent development.
Managers for demonstrating in leadership. And so I began another project where I looked at how organizations approach the challenge of developing leaders. So I moved away from just individual training approaches to bigger picture organizational initiatives to develop talent within their organizations, and specifically leadership talent. From there, I became more and more interested in a merger that I started to see in the early part of this decade, where companies were, particularly best practice companies, were increasingly linking their leadership development processes to succession and talent management processes. And that research appeared in a book called Growing Your Company's Leaders. And Robert Fulmer and I looked at a handful of companies that are really leading the way. And then we looked at 16 organizations that were doing what we might call average practices. And what we began to realize is that a handful of best practice firms had really powerfully aligned their talent management processes with their leadership development processes. Doug Reddy and I then more recently became fascinated by the whole notion of now more integrated leadership development with talent management. And as many of you know, talent management became a very popular term by this first decade of the new millennium. And increasingly we hear the word talent management instead of actually leadership development. So the term is kind of, in many ways, superseded leadership development. The term itself, talent management, got a big push, as many of you will remember, in '99 when McKinsey published an article called The War for Talent. And as many of you recall, that was built around the notion that e-commerce was stealing away particularly young, high-talented people in the software technology space. And companies, large established companies, were scrambling to hold on to their talent as many young people exited to go to these startups. And it created, in many ways, what we might today say was the kind of first talent scare. Now, in reality, as all of you can appreciate, great talent has always been highly mobile. And in really beginning in the 60s and 70s, with the gradual rise of executive recruiting firms, talent became increasingly mobile because headhunting firms were getting more and more sophisticated at identifying talent, cataloging talent. In strange ways, they became better than some established organizations were with their own talent. And headhunting firms became the great lubricators of moving talent. That has even gotten much more accelerated with the rise of web-based organizations like Monster.com and even firms like Cisco, who now have very powerful web recruiting sites. So you can think about really starting in the late 90s and accelerating to this day, lots of forces that now allow us to move talent much more powerfully and also to identify talent that's hidden away inside your organization. That talent is now much more visible to the outside world, which makes it more prone to being taken. In a minute, I'll also talk about generational changes that, as we all can appreciate, younger generations have a mobility concept that they begin their career with, that you don't want to stay too long at a firm because actually you advance faster, you earn more money, you get more opportunity by mobility rather than by stability. Before I go to there, though, I want to talk a little bit basically about, why talent management, talent development is so critical. Again, as you can all appreciate, it's become, I would argue, much more than a buzzword. It's become a reality. There are a couple of recent studies that show the advantage from a purely quantitative financial standpoint. I'm going to show you a couple of these, three of these. One is a DDI leadership forecast that was recently published, which showed that the organizations, these are mostly larger firms, that have strong talent management systems actually enjoy higher ROE and profitability than their competitors do. There is also another study that was done in manufacturing plants, which showed that organizations who were more sophisticated around their talent management processes in 6 critical areas actually delivered much higher returns, had greater operating efficiencies, better margins, and a stronger ROI. The McKinsey study in '99 also showed that there was a direct correlation between the quality of an organization's talent systems and shareholder return. So increasingly, those of you who are in organizations where you're having to advocate for spending time and energy and money on talent management, increasingly there is some very powerful data which shows that indeed there is a direct link between investments in talent and talent systems and returns. That said, Doug Reddy and I, my co-author on this particular project, we canvassed several dozen very large global firms, which we asked their senior HR officers, how do you have pretty strong systems in place for talent management? 90-some% said yes, but then we asked the second question, which is how effective are these on delivering on the promise of talent management? And a very small percentage said they did. So while many firms have talent management processes in place, there is some type of enormous gap between the presence of these systems and their delivery in terms of actually developing talent, retaining talent, attracting talent, and bringing talent on into new roles that doesn't get itself derailed. But let me step back a bit and say, well, why are we so concerned about talent? Again, this won't be new to most of us, but I want to build the case for why in some ways we are in certain areas on the edge of the perfect storm. The Brookings Institute, which is based in the United States, it's an institute that looks at macroeconomic factors, has done a series of studies looking at the rise of what we could call the intangible asset. In other words, if you look at publicly traded companies, what percentage of their assets are tangible? Factories, plants, land, real estate, retail operations, go down the long list of tangible assets, laboratories, versus intangible assets. And some of those are financial assets, but a large number of those intangible assets are people. You see a stunning contrast between 1982 and 2003 with the rise of the intangible asset from 38% in 82 to 2003 in 80% in 2003. What this basically highlights is that increasingly people are the most important asset. Many of you will be aware of the saying that Microsoft has very, very small percentage of its assets are plant, buildings, tangible assets. 99% of it basically is knowledge, embedded in knowledge workers. So increasingly, and particularly in the Western world, people are the primary asset. Secondly, changing employee expectations. We're all kind of painfully aware of this, really beginning in the 60s and 70s. We saw this in the United States, to a lesser extent in Western Europe, although it's increasing in recent years. The massive layoffs in large established organizations, which broke the lifetime employment contract. Changing employee expectations about loyalty, about staying, stability. So increasingly, people don't expect to stay because they don't believe the contract is one of stability. So that has created far greater mobility in people. In the U.S., and this varies by country, so those of you who are outside of the U.S., we have to look at your own country situations. Some of you are in countries where actually quite the contrary. We wouldn't see this. But countries like Japan, parts of Western Europe have profiles which are either similar to the U.S. or more severe. In the U.S., what we see is that about 30 million managers will retire in the next 5 years. But at the same time, the number of management jobs is about to grow. And the pool of people, and this pool would be 30 to 50-year-olds, those are the natural ones to move into management roles or have already been in management roles, will actually shrink. So what we're seeing is a growing demand for management roles, but actually the pool of people going into those roles is smaller than it has been historically. Again, creating a bit of a perfect storm in terms of talent issues. What we will see, I think, is a lot of creativity in the sense that those of you who are listening to me who are baby boomers, you can expect to be probably having job offers through your 60s and maybe your 70s. What the research shows is that firms which employ people who are over 55, those individuals tend to stay. They tend to hang on to the job. They tend to report far lower degrees of absenteeism, and they tend to be more satisfied and happier workers. So I think many of us will be hopefully working at least through our 60s and maybe our 70s on our third or fourth career. So while this is potentially a severe problem, there are creative ways to fill in these gaps that I think organizations the clever ones will rise to the occasion. The next area, of course, is globalization, the rise of emerging markets. Those of you who are in Asia particularly will appreciate this, that young Chinese managers coming into a role, if a company can hold on to them for a year, that's a fantastic achievement. Young Chinese managers are saying, if I move on opportunity, fantastic. Let me just keep moving, and I'll learn as much as I can, and then head off to the next opportunity. In some ways, in emerging countries, some of the younger people are even more exaggerated perceptions of what we see in North America and Western Europe of the youngest generations, which is keep moving. There's more opportunity if you keep moving than if you stay. But this creates an enormous dilemma for firms that are entering these markets. They just can't hang on to their young people. And, of course, these are the pipeline generation to middle management and then ultimately senior management. So this is quite a serious dilemma, particularly for Western firms coming into emerging countries. I mentioned this earlier, but I have to go back to it because executive recruiting firms have become very powerful. They have capabilities. They keep deep catalogs of talent. They track talent. In some ways, I wish some of the companies that I know were as sophisticated in tracking their talent as executive recruiting firms. As I said earlier, these are the great lubricants of moving people. And remember, they move people, they earn more money. So the incentive is track talent, move it whenever there's the right opportunity. And from the standpoint of talent, these are wonderful mechanisms to create future opportunities for them, as well as internet-based recruiting. We're in an era where organizations are much leaner. We see this flatter. Now, what this has done to talent development is quite serious. There's a positive in the sense that you now potentially have more responsibility. But the dark side or shadow side of the leaner organization is that developmental opportunities in the middle levels of organizations have shrunk. So 20 years ago, a global company would have had oftentimes country managers. And the country manager was a multifunctional role. It was a terrific grooming area. You basically were running a whole country. And you would get those roles in your 30s, and at the oldest, maybe 40. So you were having a true leadership experience in your mid-career. What happened as companies leaned themselves down, they went to global lines of business, global functional lines. They wiped out many of these roles, and now in countries they might have a marketing head. They might have a head of production. So instead of a country head, they have a functional head, which means that the multifunctional roles that people learn from increasingly are vanishing. And now you get into those multifunctional roles much later in your career, in your mid-40s to late 40s, and you come from a functional track into those. So the leaner organization has actually created some very, I would argue, important developmental gaps that we were able to address 15, 20 years ago. Today we're moving siloed talent at a later age into multifunctional roles, which means the possibility of derailment is higher, the sophistication is lower because they don't have an enterprise-wide view often. Final thing is this idea, which I talked about earlier, which Doug and I found in the survey, which is oftentimes the systems are there, but they may be outdated, or they actually may not be used in ways by the line that align themselves powerfully to talent and talent's needs. One of the things that I wanted to do in this webinar with you is get a gauge from you, where is your organization on many of these issues. So you'll see on your screen a question that I've got for you. And the question is, how serious is the talent challenge facing your organization? And what I'd like to do is have you just rate on a 1 to 5 scale how serious it is. And as you'll see on the screen, 1 meaning very little challenge facing us. We're in good shape, no need to worry for the future. And 5, at the other end of the extreme, a very, very serious challenge facing us. Lots of talent gaps, lots of talent retention dilemmas. 2 or 3, of course, would mean a moderate amount, or is getting fairly serious. So if you could take a moment and give us a score. Let's see what we have out there. Okay. So what I can see is that most people are seeing the challenge in the 3 to 5 area. Terrific. So moderately serious to serious. Okay. Now, one of the things which I wanted to also get was a sense from you, looking at your own career, how thoughtfully and carefully has your organization worked to develop you as a leader? So if you would take just one more minute and send in a response. 1, little or no planning and care given to my own development as a leader. It's pretty much I'm the master of my own destiny. They haven't intervened. They haven't done much planning. They haven't been terribly thoughtful. All the way to 5, great planning and care. Certainly on an annual basis, people meet with me, my own manager, my HR person, important individuals have been very thoughtful about helping me develop, grow as a leader. That would be a 5. So let's see what you think. So actually, it's looking a little bleak. Quite a number of 1s and 2s and 3s. Hardly anyone at the 5 level. Some at the 4 level, but it looks like the average here is about a 2 if we take the lower 3 bars. So we can say that generally not a great deal of care and planning for most of us. Now I want to move us to what we found in our research for Harvard Business Review article, Make Your Organization a Talent Factory. What we found in looking at a range of organizations, the article itself, though, features P&G, Procter & Gamble, and HSBC. We chose them because we felt they were illustrative. P&G has been at it much longer than HSBC in terms of a global talent approach. But HSBC has had a number of kind of very important initiatives in recent years, given their very rapid spread across the globe, to build a deeper talent management side. In looking at those 2 organizations and looking at others that we've both worked with and researched, what came out of our own research was that there were 2 critical factors. One is what we call high functionality. In other words, the organization had not only a range of talent management processes, but they were very rigorous and disciplined in their implementation. And most importantly, they were tied directly to the strategy and to the organization's culture. So they were used to powerfully align and produce talent to help the firm achieve its strategic objectives, as well as to socialize and build the culture. The second component we found was high vitality, and that is that the kind of critical stakeholders, and in a minute you'll see the word stakeholders includes not only the CEO and the executive team, but line management and individuals and individual managers were engaged, committed, and held accountable for talent management. Now, you could have a firm that's high on one and low on the other, but by the way, that would not be enough to deliver on the promise of a firm that actually delivers a deep and steady stream of talent. We discovered you actually have to have both, and they have to be in fairly high levels to achieve the outcomes you would want. So let me show you. This is a little, it's got all the dimensions here of functionality you'll see in front of you. I wanted to lay them out for you, from sourcing to assimilation to development to rewards, engagement. And what we found was that the firms that actually had depth in these arenas and were disciplined about them and did it on a global basis, again, we're looking primarily at global firms, were far more effective on delivering on the functionality. Now, one of the things which I have found in the last 10 years is that it's almost impossible to find a firm or organization that does all of these dimensions at a world-class level. What I have found is that world-class talent firms do several of these dimensions at a world-class level, and then the others at a good-class level. So it's very difficult to have all of these at a perfect 10 where you're ideal. Firms that actually do not achieve kind of this high level of functionality have average to good dimensions here across the grid. So the more a firm's able to deliver on the promise of these, the more effective they'll be. Now, the reason why no one's probably, maybe one firm out there, but I haven't found them, is probably a 10 on all these dimensions, why it's difficult to get to there, is because some of these systems are changing given changing demands. And so they're in a trial mode as the organization is trying to figure out how should rewards be changing given the changing nature of our business. Retention, for example, might be world-class at the mid-manager level, but at the front line, because of demographic changes, they still may be in experimental mode. Now, as you look across all those dimensions, I've got a question for you. We'll go back to polling. Thinking about your own organization and looking at these dimensions of functionality, I'm going to ask you to rate your organization's effectiveness. How good is your firm at delivering on the functionality dimension? A 1 would be ineffective. Across most of those dimensions, the firm really does not have capabilities that are able to deliver on those dimensions. To 5, highly effective across most of the dimensions. We're world class. We're just superb. Again, not necessarily all of them, but certainly a majority of them. So if you would, reflecting on your own organization, where would you put it? On a 1 to 5. Okay, so the results are in. It looks like the majority of us see our organization on the functionality dimension in the 2 to 3 range. So we'll probably average it out to about a 2.5. So mid-range. It doesn't appear that anyone gave a 5, and a small number of us gave a 4. Slightly larger number of us actually gave it a 1. but it appears that most would be in the mid-range, with the highest number being in the two range. Great, thank you. Now, I wanted to illustrate one of these dimensions on the functionality side, and I'm going to use Procter & Gamble because they're really terrific in terms of using job assignments to develop global talent. In a minute, I'm going to show you the career progression of I can't even use the word high potential. She's a world-class leader. The philosophy at Procter & Gamble is to use countries and functions and brands to develop a person. So in your career, you will move across countries and often across brands and potentially across some functions to develop a well-rounded general manager. When you show great promise, your first promotion as a GM will be in a small country, and you kind of cut your teeth on that country. Again, this notion that a country is the perfect place to learn more of an enterprise view, move out of a purely functional background because you've got lots of different functions reporting to you. From there, actually, you go to a mature country, and mature countries could be something like the UK, could be Canada. These are marketplaces that have been well established. Procter & Gamble has been in them for a long time. Because they're mature, they have also, though, some wonderful competitive challenges because the players tend to be large. They may have growth challenges because categories in those markets may be potentially a little more stable, so you have the challenge of growing a business. Then from there, you move to country clusters. So you might get Eastern Europe. Now what you're learning is kind of critical differences across the countries. You've learned a little, bit of that as you move from a small country to a mature country. But now you get to see the interrelationships. You get a much bigger perspective in terms of economics and politics and their influence on markets, market opportunities. If you do well in leading a country cluster, that becomes a springboard to being an executive. So Procter & Gamble strategically uses countries as training grounds to move their talent. I'm going to show you the career progression of Daniela Riccardi, who, as you can probably discern from her name, is Italian. She joins Procter & Gamble literally at the beginning of her career, and she's assigned as an assistant brand manager in Italy. That's her first role. From there, she's promoted to a brand manager in Italy. And as you see, she'll spend 6 years in those two capacities learning about brand management in Italy. So she'll get great depth around the brand in a particular country that's, in this case, a mature country. She will be moved from there, promoted to Belgium, and made a marketing manager, where she'll stay for 3 years. And what I like about Procter & Gamble is they keep you in a place long enough so you get a sense of whether your initiatives that you launched in the first year, how those pan out in the next 2 to 3 years. Because oftentimes initiatives that you launch in the first year take a year or two to show how effectively they have worked. So they're not moving you so fast you actually don't learn from initiatives that you have implemented. You're there long enough, and you get some mastery. From there, she'll be moved to Latin America. Now she's moving to a country cluster zone, and she's, though, in a functional role. But from there, she'll go to being made the general manager of Latin America. So she's been moved from a Western European nation, a mature market, into more growth markets, very different dynamics, very different economics, very different political dimensions. And she'll get her first more executive level opportunity as the Vice President of Latin America. She'll spend 7 years total in these 3 roles getting mastery over Latin America. There's such a thing as mastery over Latin America. And then she'll go back to Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe at this time is a rapidly developing market arena for P&G. So she's now back in in Europe, but she's on the developing side. And she'll stay there for 4 years, really learning about this market. And then it's not so surprising that after that grooming, she'll be made the president of Greater China. So you look at her career, she started in a mature market in a functional area. She moved over to another country within that mature market, Belgium. So she's got a contrast. She's not going to assume that because it's the UK and I was in Italy, it's going to be the same. She'll go to an emerging market and really get 7 years of depth in that market, Latin America. She'll then go to a rapidly emerging kind of hot market, Eastern Europe, and then to one of Procter & Gamble's most promising future markets with, you could probably say not even a future market because the growth there has been so remarkable. So you can see the kind of care and attention that's devoted to her career and the grooming and producing more and more of an enterprise view, but always keeping her in positions long enough to learn. I've also highlighted, this is a bit overwhelming, but I wanted to bring in the Bank of America because it's quite clever. They have a very sophisticated onboarding process for their executives. So when we think about development, even at the executive level, they're taking their most senior talent and they're putting them through a very rigorous 180-day process to help them onboard effectively at the executive level. What we do know from research on executive failure, derailment, is that failures are very high at this level. And so the Bank of America has a very deep kind of functionality gift around onboarding their most senior talent with all these different kinds of check-ins, 360 feedback, peer coaches, programs where they integrate the new leader into their team, confidential interviews that are 360 based to give the new executive heads up into areas that they're going to face as challenges. Just very, very thoughtful, in-depth interventions to help people get on board. So I use this and Daniela as examples of the rigorousness of the functionality dimension. I want to move from there to vitality. I mentioned actually that the two of them are integral. Vitality is the engagement, commitment, and accountability dimension of talent management. As you can see, when I think about vitality, it's got 4 stakeholders: top team, the talent pool themselves, the line managers who make the talent system work, they implement it, and then the HR and talent staff. Without commitment of these 4 key groups, you don't get the vitality dimension. And this is very important because this is hard to copy. This is an emotional commitment. This is not a process that can be taken. And in many ways, this is the gasoline or energy behind the motor of talent management in these firms. So I'd like to ask you a question. Would you think for a moment about the overall effectiveness of the vitality dimension of your organization? What's the level of engagement at all the levels? What's the commitment? And how accountable are people held for delivering on talent management at all levels? So if you would, think for a moment, overarching vitality dimension. One would be ineffective. This week is not a lot of commitment. It's not a deeply vital process. There's not a lot of emotional commitment. Or it's the flavor of this year, and probably next year it will pass. To 5, a deep, deep commitment. People really are energized. They deeply believe in talent, and they are committed to making the organization a talent-based organization. So what we see is mostly 2s, some 3s, but the largest number is 2s, and the second would be 3s. So down at the lower end in general. Okay. I want to give you just a few insights into this dimension. I'm going to look at Procter & Gamble, and then we'll go from there to your questions. So the first is fostering commitment. If you look at Procter & Gamble, they begin by hiring you at the entry level. They don't go out, hire you at mid-level. That's relatively rare, with the exception of acquisitions. They put you in an intern program when you're a college student, where you get to spend the summer at P&G. You get to learn about the firm. The firm gets to learn about you. They put you on major projects that you actually make presentations to senior managers about. It's so that you can learn and get excited about P&G, and they can learn and get excited about you. It's a build-within culture. If you look at the executive team, you'll see that literally all the top team started their career at P&G. There's an enormous amount of opportunity and loyalty. And as you saw with Daniela's career, there's this very steady progression. If you are talented, you move throughout opportunities. So it's a commitment to the individuals. Foster engagement. Here what we see is when you arrive, you work with your hiring manager, and then this is true throughout your entire career, to figure out what are the next set of moves that will build career development currency. They actually have this as a term, which is these are the jobs you've held that actually are promising for your future and that the company actually values as developmental opportunities. If you're a high potential, you receive what are called these destination jobs, which you saw with Daniela, where she's getting literally the vice president of Latin America, running the emerging growth market of Eastern Europe, and then ultimate destination job of Greater China. University recruiting is all line-led. In other words, Procter & Gamble managers, not HR per se, they go out and they do all the recruiting. So they're deeply involved in searching for talent. They build relationships with the schools. They build relationships with the students. And this gets the managers and general managers and executives thinking deeply about how do we engage our future talent in Procter & Gamble. The final one is accountability. And I think as many of you would appreciate, accountability starts at the top. CEO Lafley actually owns the talent pools of what are called the top 16s, which are the top 16 markets, the top 16 brands, the top 16 customers. So this is a lot of people. And Lafley basically spends an enormous amount of time reviewing who's in the pools, getting to know these individuals, holding accountable the people who actually are the senior executives responsible for the different groups. He also sponsors and teaches in the leadership programs for the top several hundred at Procter & Gamble. And you are evaluated and compensated on development as a manager and as Procter & Gamble. So quite powerful. What I'd like to do now that I've given you a sense of what makes for an outstanding talent management organization, strength and vitality and strength and functionality, is I'd like to turn now to questions that you have. We have several questions that have already come in, and I'd be happy to start with those, and then you may have others. Arthur, I think you'd like to ask me those.
Yes, Jay, thank you very much. We've had several come in, and I think we'll lead off with one from Betty, and she asks us, how do we convince upper management to act now versus later on these talent management issues?
Well, I go back to the why now slides. I think upper management tends to be sold well on data. And what I would do is I would go and I would look at the different levels of your organization and the different functional groups, and I would get turnover data, retention data, and I would build a compelling case around the areas where you have high turnover, and particularly if those areas are core to the success of your organization. So if you're in the toy industry and you've got toy designers having high turnover rates, that's the place where I would begin. I would say, look at the turnover rates here. This skill set is core to our business, and yet we've got 30% turnover rates annually. And I would begin with that kind of framing core talent, high turnover areas. I would also then highlight to them, what do the retirement numbers look like over the next 5 years? How many people are moving out in industries like the oil industry, where I spent a lot of time? What you'll see there is that they have an enormous retirement problem. In 5 to 10 years, in some of these oil companies, 30 to 40% of the population of managers will have retired. So I would look for those hot spots and sell the organization on those for investment.
Great, thanks. Our next question is from Michael, and he asks, why is globalization at the center of the functionality and vitality model?
Good question. It's primarily because we looked at global companies. We also wanted to look at global companies because we felt those were the most difficult circumstances in which to build rigorous talent management processes, because you ultimately had to create systems that were both people felt committed to, that they implemented them across the world, but also systems that had a measure of flexibility so you could be adaptive given the challenges of your particular country. So that's why we chose the globalization. There was simply the companies. We wanted to go to the most difficult environments in which to implement talent management processes. So they have to be rigorous, but with a measure of flexibility.
Great, thanks. I'll read from some of our write-in comments from registrants. One has asked, what are the main differences and similarities in executive and strategic leadership development across different cultures and nations, for example, the U.S., U.K., India, and China?
Having taught in a few of those countries, some of the big differences would be the fact that the U.S. has a love affair with leadership. And so if you look at just the amount of time and energy that's gone into leadership development, the U.S. has been doing it for about 20, 25 years. The U.K. became, I would argue, deeply interested in leadership development in about the last 15 years. India and China are now becoming quite interested in it, although they have had academics who have been studying leadership in those countries for quite a long time. They have only somewhat recently begun to invest in a large-scale way in executive and strategic leadership development. So one is just the time frame in which they've been investing. Secondly, there are some differences, as you might imagine, culturally. That said, what has always surprised me is that American models of leadership have tended to be exported across the world. So we have models which were devised in the 50s and 60s. And many of you will remember these, the task versus social leader. You'll see those being taught in China and in India. From our standpoint, from my standpoint, I should say, those are managerial models. But they have rigorous methodologies for teaching them that have been developed 20, 30 years ago, and they're models that are quite easy to teach. So what I find is in some of the emerging markets, leadership development is more at a foundational level. And in the U.S. and the U.K. and parts of Europe, many of the leadership courses are focused around, for example, leading change, kind of higher, more complex dimensions of leadership.
Great, thanks, Jay. Meredith is asking if you have some examples of how the model is applied in the public sector.
Unfortunately, I don't. Doug and I have not actually studied the public sector, so I sadly don't. I am aware that only indirectly from things I've read that organizations like the IRS, for example, and even the Postal Service in the U.S. have actually been making important investments in these areas. So I do know that there are governmental agencies that actually have been getting very committed. And I would argue the military, Marines, Army, these organizations have we would call very rigorous leadership development processes, which we might also describe as talent management. Not-for-profits, it varies. Having worked with some healthcare organizations or hospital organizations, there are a number now that are actually implementing these in a big way. I haven't studied them, but I've worked with some of them, and it's largely because of the scramble for high-quality physicians, high-quality nursing talent. So there are areas in the not-for-profit where you have serious talent problems, and organizations are, I think, doing some creative work in those spaces.
Great, thanks, Jay. David would like to know what the criteria for leadership development was at Procter & Gamble.
What's the criteria for leadership development?
Yeah, he has a follow-on. Is how much of it was product and brand for performance versus more established leadership development criteria like people skills and so forth?
Okay. Well, they do have a very strong knowledge-based emphasis. So brand knowledge, market knowledge are very, very integral pieces of the leadership development piece. They do have training programs, which would be some of the interpersonal skills side, which you would take at different stages of your career. Your evaluations have those dimensions of leadership, the interpersonal dimensions embedded in them. So there is some performance measurement built around those. But they rely heavily upon job assignments, as you can see from Daniela's career, and also mentoring. It's a firm that is quite committed to mentoring. So you're learning from bosses along the way. But from our perspective, probably not as heavily from traditional training programs.
Great, thanks. Chris would like to know what have you found about the effect of labor contracts in different countries in talent identification and recruitment?
Well, unfortunately, Chris, that's not one of my specialties. So I have not focused on kind of labor, blue-collar workers, unions. So unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that question with any insight or expertise that I would like to have. Be more vicarious observation.
Okay, thanks. Michael would like to ask, do you have any observations about B players in the talent pool that you'd like to share?
Well, that's a great question. B players, that's a really wonderful one, and I hesitate to say because what we know about B players is sometimes they're just in the wrong place, or they have a boss that doesn't have the right chemistry with them. And if they're moved, we all of a sudden can see them become an A player. So what I always feel with a B player is that we need to think carefully about their next move. Many years ago, I interviewed the head of the Marine Corps. He was the Marine Commandant. And I said, what's the most interesting thing you've ever learned about leadership development? And he said, well, we spent tens of millions of dollars on a study that tried to discern whether a captain who is promoted to, say, colonel would be an outstanding leader at the colonel level, and they were outstanding at the captain level. And he said what we learned is there's an element of unpredictability. We would often take a superb captain and make him a colonel, and they would be an okay colonel, but not outstanding. We take an average captain and make him a colonel, and he would be outstanding. Despite the best systems we could deploy to kind of assess individuals, there was this element of unpredictability. So I do think it's worth, with B players, really kind of searching out, well, what might be contributing to their B degree, and then thinking carefully about projects or opportunities to give them another chance to demonstrate their A opportunities.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and we'll take this one from Darvin, who is asking, what's the best way to get a person utilized globally if they have no global exposure currently?
If they have no global experience, well, of course, the easiest way would be actually send them overseas. Now, then if we're thinking about that, I would go back to the issue. I'd want to know a lot about that individual, and I'd want to know about have they traveled before? Are they naturally adventurous? If they have a level of flexibility, because these are critical dimensions. And the more they have that kind of side of adventure, curiosity, learning ability, then I would argue you could probably send them to countries which are more challenging versus countries like a well-developed country. Those might be the places you'd send somebody who didn't score high. I think what I love about Procter & Gamble is they're very thoughtful about country assignments and matching individual to opportunities, but also thinking about them as individuals. But I would say the best thing to do is get them placed in another country. We do have a slight disadvantage today, and particularly in Western Europe and in North America. Fewer young people want to go overseas, particularly if they're married and they have a dual career couple situation.
Okay, thank you, Jay, for your superb presentation and for answering the participants' questions. Thank you, Arthur, for being the co-organizer of this event and moderating the Q&A session. And also thank you, everyone, again, for your participation in the first ever ILA webinar. Please remember that this webinar will be available for repeat viewing online. A link will be emailed to everyone next week when it's up. We hope to see you all in Vancouver for the ILA Global Conference, and it's been a great pleasure learning and growing with you today. Have a great day.